Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Clayton Sinyai, Executive Director of the Catholic Labor Network. I'm so glad you could join us this Holy Week and on Cesar Chavez's birthday for a presentation on news from the farm worker movement. The Catholic Labor Network, as you know, is an association of the faithful in the Catholic Church and an organization that brings together Catholic union activists and Catholic clergy, lay, and religious social justice advocates to promote Catholic social teaching on labor and work. And really, one of the strongest areas of our faith and its commitment to worker justice has been accompanying the movement of farm workers through history. So for that reason, the Catholic Labor Network has become part of the National Farm Workers Ministry. And I've invited Julie Taylor, Executive Director of the National Farm Workers Ministry, to come and give us an update on the farm workers movement and all the work that they do and we do to organize solidarity with farm workers fighting for justice in the workplace. So I will hand it off to Julie Taylor. Julie, thank you.
Thank you. And it's great to be with all of you this afternoon. Talking to Clayton a little earlier, and I have lots of content, so I'm going to move right into it, and then we'll have time later when we can hopefully answer some questions and return to some things that I don't say enough about to go forward. But really happy that you're here today and that you care about farm workers and want to know what's happening. So let me just step right in. Farm workers are the 1.5 to 2, sometimes people say 2 to 2.5 million men, women, and children that are picking our fruits and vegetables. They work in nurseries, dairies, feedlots. The vast majority of them are Latino. Over 70% are immigrants. Over 50% are undocumented. And of the 50% undocumented, the largest percentage of them have been in this country for over 10 years. They might not stay continuously, but they have been working here off and on for at least 10 years. So who are farm workers? They're men, they're women, they're children. They work on farms and ranches. They are the backbone of the US's $200+ billion agricultural industry, and their labor benefits all of us every day. We're grateful for farm workers. They look like this, they look like this. Hired farm workers include field crop workers, nursery workers, and livestock workers. And so you can see from this chart that the largest part, 2/3, are family farm workers. The other are the hired farm workers, and those are the ones that we're talking about today. Most of the hired farm workers are on farms that produce food for people. And this graph is probably a little bit small, but the green represents human food. The red represents food for animals, and then there are shades in between. So you can see where this occurs to differing degrees. So almost every state has some food, but where most of the money is what this chart indicates for us. So you can see West Coast, East Coast, and then the Midwest, a lot of animal feed, right? Where are they working? About 9% of vegetable farms had sales over 500,000, yet these farms accounted for 90% of commercial sales. The majority of hired farm workers are found on the nation's largest farms with sales over $500,000 per year, conventional and organic. So a lot on large farms. They're picking tomatoes, they're picking all kinds of things. Farm workers are closest to the ground. Literally what happens in the fields happens to them. They are vulnerable because they're isolated by language. They're isolated in rural areas, so they're isolated from transportation options. They're isolated because they are fearful of being fired or deported. And this has been a rising situation, and especially the last 10 years or so. And farm workers are isolated because they're often desperate to make money. So unfortunately, it makes this population very vulnerable to exploitation. So they suffer through substandard housing. Not all of the housing is substandard, but this is a real picture from a real place. And so is this. In the state where I am, North Carolina, this bucket is legally used as a washing machine. It's the minimum standard in North Carolina for a migrant camp of 30 workers. Now, I have been to camps that have literal washing machines, but this is the minimum standard. So if you don't have this, you get fined. Otherwise, you're okay. Farm workers face the greatest threat from pesticide exposure than any other sector of society. Again, they're the ones in the fields, they're the closest to the ground. We know this. So I want to share in the words of farm workers, this video that National Farm Worker Ministry produced last year, because one of the challenges that they have, one of the things that also makes them vulnerable is the impact of climate change on them. And so I want you to listen to farm workers talk about these experiences, and they'll share a little bit about their experiences too in the midst of COVID.
Tres mujeres encontraron la muerte mientras trabajaban en viñedos del centro de California por golpes de calor.
The second time in as many weeks, farm workers are exposed to a pesticide. This time, over 70 people were affected. Some of them had to be taken to a local hospital.
Bajo las enormes columnas de humo de los devastadores incendios forestales que rodeaban estos campos de cultivo, decenas de campesinos del área de Oxnard siguieron trabajando, exponiendo seriamente su salud.
El huracán Irma dejó severos daños en el sur de la Florida, pero entre las comunidades de trabajadores agrícolas, aparte de daños estructurales en sus viviendas, dejó mucho miedo e incertidumbre.
Drought in Mexico, the worst that some parts of the country have seen for 70 years.
La razón mía de haberme venido de mi rancho, de Michoacán, fue porque allá estaba muy duro con la pobreza.
Bueno, usamos en español una expresión, se mata para trabajar.
Ay, fue horrible. Siente uno que se está muriendo.
Pues no tenemos otra opción.
Pues yo tengo 20 años trabajando aquí en el campo, echando tomate. Es duro porque a veces me meto tarde aquí y pues hay gente que me hace daño el calor. Aquí sube a 100, a 103. Es demasiado calor para nosotros, trabajadores.
Cuando salí embarazada, me dijeron que tenía que esperar un poco haciendo ese trabajo porque no había otra persona que hiciera ese trabajo. Y mi niña nació con muchos problemas de salud. Ella tenía un problema de craneosinostosis. Ella le cerró prematuro su cráneo y tenían que operarla a los 4 meses de vida para abrir su cabeza y romper sus huesos para que creciera su cabecita normal, porque su cabecita parecía un huevo.
Empecé yo a sentir un aroma fuerte, y le digo yo a mi hija, le digo, ¿sabes qué? Creo que andan sprayando, huele a pesticida. A la 1, 2, 3 de la mañana, yo me levantaba al baño a toser porque yo sentía la tos bien fuerte. Y cuando tosía, aventaba flemas con sangre. Salía sangre de mis flemas. Cada vez que tosía, sentía que mi pulmón se me iba a reventar.
Cuando llegamos estaba lleno de agua también todo la renta y lo levantó el techo. Ese sí todo lo acabó. Toda la cosecha, todo lo acabó, todo casi lo arrancó, pues. Quedamos sin trabajo, sin nada. Igualmente, quedamos sin luz, sin agua, sin nada.
A mí lo que más me interesa es el respeto y dignidad para los trabajadores.
Yo no quiero que siga pasando eso.
So, hay que apoyar a nuestra gente, a nuestros campesinos, de cualquier manera que se pueda.
Sí, pues es muy importante que las leyes se lleven a cabo aquí en el campo, porque pues, de esa forma nos protege a todo el trabajador.
Sí, hay que luchar también para cambiar leyes, para que se adapten pues también a nuestras necesidades también, pero mientras tanto pues tenemos que hacer los trabajos que nadie quiere hacer. No tenemos opción.
So you heard the voices of farm workers talk about the situations in which they live, to describe those to us. They did that last year during the pandemic. We had to meet a lot of them through Zoom, but their stories are compelling and their voices are absolutely necessary for us. And so that leads us into why is this the case and where did some of this come from? And so just to understand that farm workers and domestic workers were excluded from the New Deal in the 30s. It wasn't a coincidence. The domestic labor and field labor were jobs that had been previously held by slaves. And so this was how some of the legislation got passed. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 forbids employers from firing a worker for joining, organizing, or supporting a labor union, but it specifically excludes farm workers and domestic workers. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 excluded farm workers until 1966. At that time, it began to allow for a required minimum wage in the US, but did not provide overtime pay and other provisions. And any farm that employs fewer than 7 workers in a calendar quarter are exempt from these rules, from these requirements. In 1983, the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act was passed, and this allowed for farm labor contractors to be licensed in the US. It required that housing had to meet local and federal housing standards, and the transportation vehicles for farm workers had to meet basic federal safety standards and be insured. A grower who uses a farm labor contractor is responsible as a joint employer with that farm labor contractor. Why is that important? It's important because growers sometimes hire a farm labor contractor to organize their workers and then say that they're not responsible when wages aren't paid fairly or when there are grievances that come up about treatment on farms or if there are housing difficulties. And corporations do the same thing. They claim they don't have responsibility for the workers because they've hired other people to manage the workers for them. And so there's an ongoing need to be sure that farm labor contractors are jointly responsible with the employer or the grower or the farm owner so that you can't pass the buck. The H-2A program that came out of that migrant and seasonal labor law provided for temporary guest worker visas for field workers to come into this country and work seasonally between 3 and 9 months a year. In 2005, there were 48,000 of those visas that were certified by the Department of Labor. As you can see, it's gone up a tremendous amount since then. So I looked at a chart yesterday for the records for 2020, 275,430 worker positions were certified in 2020. So it was a small portion of the workforce at one point. Now it's a much larger portion of the workforce. In 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed. It gave 1.1 million Mexican farm workers legal status. The idea was that they could legally work in this country, so they would have access to U.S. provisions, but the ag industry didn't change anything. They didn't improve wages for that. And so they have continued to need a source of cheap labor. And so are turning to farm labor contractors and are increasingly using more and more temporary workers, H-2A workers. A lot of the folks who gained legal status because of the pay and conditions in the fields actually use their legal status to move to other professions like construction or other kinds of work that could be more year-round. Between 1994 and 2001, after the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, was signed, there was a flood of cheap subsidized US corn that went into Mexico and caused the price of Mexico's crop to fall 70%. Mexico's small farmers were not able to compete with this, and over 2 million of those small farmers lost their livelihoods. So immigration from Mexico increased. Formerly small farmers became farm workers in the US. Today is Cesar Chavez's birthday. It's part of the reason we're having this event during Farm Worker Awareness Week. This quote by Cesar Chavez is sort of the core of the way in which the National Farm Worker Ministry works. Because Cesar said, from the depth of need and despair, people can work together, can organize themselves to solve their own problems and fill their own needs with dignity and strength. That is the way in which National Farm Worker Ministry works. We don't tell the farm workers what they should do. We stand with them in solidarity. We take our cues from the farm worker organizing groups about the ways in which we can help support their campaigns and continue the farm worker movement. So some solutions to mention briefly. Of course, listen to farm workers first. Bring farm workers to the table. Treat farm workers with dignity, with the dignity and respect that they and their work deserve. Recognize that worker rights are human rights, and farm workers deserve the same worker rights as every worker in our country. Farm workers need a comprehensive immigration reform, something that provides a pathway to citizenship or immigration status for the nearly 1.5 million farm workers currently undocumented, along with their families, to end the fear that keeps farm workers from challenging unfair and abusive labor practices and reduces the exploitation that they suffer now. Immigration impacts everything that happens to farm workers. 73% of all agricultural workers are foreign born. 16% of all agricultural workers are migrating within the US, while 84% are seasonal workers, both domestic and foreign. So, and you would understand this as part of the Catholic Labor Network, support farm worker unions and organizations. Just to mention a few of those, the United Farm Workers Union in California is the oldest. Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and Larry Ithlong founded this over 50 years ago. When workers are part of the UFW contracts, they have a voice in the workplace, they have higher wages. Through the UFW, they have pensions, health insurance, and in the contract, they have seniority and job security. That it's unlike that in any other farm worker union in the country. In the 1980s, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee established the first three-way bargaining agreements between corporate processors, growers, and farm workers. Some of you may remember a Campbell's Soup boycott. So the agreement was between Campbell's Soup as a company, the farmers that supplied Campbell's Soup, and the farm workers who worked for those farmers. Farm Labor Organizing Committee is based in Toledo, Ohio, but it has an office in North Carolina. It actually has the larger part of its membership here in North Carolina, and they continue to work on three-way bargaining agreements. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers is not a union, but it is an organizing group of farm workers and supporters in Immokalee. A lot of people have heard about them. But they work under a fair food program that corporations sign on to that provides a penny a pound more for tomatoes and has a code of conduct that's enforced throughout the farms that have the fair food program. They are currently in a boycott of Wendy's because Wendy's is the last major fast food company that has not yet signed the fair food agreement. And in large degree, the Immokalee, Florida is an area where most of the tomatoes are grown for the fast food companies. And so that's why they have been working on those groups over the years. You can see on the left, the groups that have signed with them: McDonald's, Taco Bell. Taco Bell was the first one, Burger King. So there's a 24-hour hotline for reporting. They have a council that addresses complaints. They do training with workers and supervisors at the same time. And again, monitor a code of conduct. Every year they do a survey at each of their farms to see if folks are complying with that. And then there's recourse for that. Another food certification program that some farm worker partners, the UFW and a few others, are on the board of directors for is this group called the Equitable Food Initiative. If you shop at Costco, Costco uses Equitable Food Initiative and I think Fair Trade food as part of their fresh fruits and vegetables. And so this group works on a similar standard, labor issues, pest management, and have a real strong focus on food safety. And then the Agricultural Justice Project has a food justice certification that they do farm by farm, area to area. They're based in Oregon. We stand with farm workers and support their campaigns. In this case, you can see people from the National Farmworker Movement and other advocates out in Washington State in front of a berry company where we, for about 3 years, we had a boycott with them, and they were one of the major berries during that time. It was settled in 2016 after public pressure. So I just ran through a lot of information quickly to give you an introduction to a little bit of where we are, how we got here, who the players are and whatever. And so would you like to ask some questions?